we are ready to start the meeting that we've called Russia after the first year of the war, and to give us a bit of insights into what has happened in Russia, how the war has influenced Russian society, but also politics, military politics, security politics, trade, and so on. We've invited Flemming Splidsboel Hansen from the Danish Institute for International Studies, one of the leading experts on all things Russian. And he'll give us a brief overview of his main points. And after that, we'll say hello to Jurij and Maria, a Russian-Ukrainian couple who met online, as I understand it, but moved outside Ukraine and Russia to be together in Beograd. So we'll hear a bit of hear their story and hear a bit about how the war has influenced ordinary people and everyday lives for Russians. So we'll start with you, Flemming Splidsboel Hansen. Warm welcome to you. Very nice of you to take the time to be here. And we've asked you to tell us a bit about Russia after this first year of the war.
Great, thank you. Thank you for this kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me, of course, to this very exciting event. I actually did my PhD dissertation, which you see somewhere on the shelf behind me, on relations between Russia and the European Union. And I would like to start there, actually, and then sort of go into Russia instead, but just to paint the bigger picture, to get us perhaps a sense of what is happening. Now, when I do public lectures, and I did one only last night, I speak about the historical setting of what we're witnessing right now. And in a way, it's similar to 1989, the end of the Cold War. What basically happened when the Cold War ended is that Central Europe, a belt of Central European states, were cut free from the Soviet Union. And they later joined the European Union. Of course, they also joined NATO, but they joined the European Union. The European Union, in a way, was ready to take on this challenge and to sort of help transition these countries and incorporate them into the European Union. What is possibly happening now in 2022 and 23, 24, it's unclear when this will happen, is that Eastern Europe will finally be cut free from Russia. And so it is a historic moment. It's a historic process in a way which may sort of help us tidy up or tie up the end of the Cold War, and even in a longer term perspective, the end of the Second World War, with the Yalta Conference and the shadow of Yalta, which still sort of falls heavily on Eastern Europe. So that's part of the setting, and that's also why we need to understand why so much is at stake. It also helps to explain European Union involvement for many different reasons, but this is also one of them, perhaps. And I think it's slowly dawning on European Union publics that this is also what is at stake and what is happening here. It also helps to understand perhaps what is happening on the Russian side, and understanding that, let's just be brutally honest, these former colonies are breaking away finally from Russia. And Putin, I think Russian President Putin understands that this is the moment. Either he decides to keep them, or he manages to keep them within his sphere of influence, or they're gone forever. And one of the ways in which we can see that they will be gone, of course, is that they have slowly been gravitating away from Russia towards Europe, towards the European Union for years, is, of course, that the European Union decided to give candidate status to Ukraine and Moldova in June last year. It's a major, major event, and it's something that we do not discuss enough. I think it really needs to be understood and to discuss how this will sort of unfold. Inside Russia, as a response to this, of course, we're seeing now, because of the war has been dragging on, now it's 1 year, a radicalization of Russian society. For those of you who heard Putin speak yesterday, it was actually a sort of relatively calm speech. It was very much directed at a Russian audience. Now, when I look at Russian media today and they sum up the main points, of course, they speak about the strategic arms treaty, which is very significant, but they speak mainly about different issues that relate to everyday life in Russia. So in a way, it was an interesting speech in that it was rather calm, and Putin, rather than saying this is a historical moment, this is this is a historical war. The existence of the Russian state itself is at stake. In a way, he was saying there is a war. Let's talk about something else. And then he talked about everyday life. But it is, when you look at it overall, radicalized Russian regime. It's gone from something which was quite oppressive and controlling to something which is even more oppressive and even more controlling. My best reading is that Putin will remain radicalized. It's very difficult for him to step back and to return to what he had before the 24th of February last year. So we're seeing a regime that needs sort of to radicalize itself, to gravitate around the concept of war, to keep itself in power. And that's what we need to deal with. For the European Union, it means that we are looking at a tremendous challenge, how to deal with this radicalized Russia. It has severe consequences, of course. Russian media open Russian media explain that as many as 800,000 Russians left Russia last year, which is the greatest exodus from Russia since 1917. So that tells us something is happening inside Russia also, and the European Union needs to figure out how to deal with it. The way that we have dealt with it so far is that we have suspended all cooperation. There's nothing left, and it will probably remain like this. We also need to figure out how to deal with Belarus, the other state, together with Russia, that is sort of outside of the European family, and the European Union has basically nothing now in place with these two states. The European Union also needs to figure out how to deal with states like Ukraine, Moldova, possibly even Georgia, possibly even Armenia later on, how to pull these states into its orbit, let's just put it like that. And the European Union so far has been reluctant to really deal with these states, had a lot of challenges in the Western Balkans, but now Ukraine and Moldova inside the waiting room, they're waiting now for further instructions on how to proceed, and they're waiting now to get invited into the European Union itself. President Zelensky has said 2 years. It's completely unrealistic. I had conversations with Ukrainian experts only last week on EU membership, and they said, well, 2 years is unrealistic, maybe 7 years. But 7 years could also be unrealistic. But of course, these are extraordinary times, and maybe 7 years is what we're looking at. So the European Union needs to figure out how to deal with this radicalized Russia. We need to have a plan for this, and we need to figure out how to deal with this belt of East European states that may finally be cut free from the Russian Empire and be free to choose their own destiny, their own course of action. And this destiny and this course of action will take them closer to the European Union. And it's something that we need to have a conversation about, and we're starting this today, and I really, really welcome this. So thank you. I'll keep it at this for introduction, and then I'm very curious and interested, of course, to hear more about everyday life in Russia. So thank you for now.
Thanks a lot, Flemming. We'll get back to you in just a moment, but we have Jurij and Maria with us. And yes, there you are. Jurij, can you tell us a bit about yourselves? Who are you two?
We are just actually, regular persons. I'm from Russia, she is Ukrainian, actually, and actually nothing special about us. And we met each other in the internet, as I said previously, in the online game. It sounds funny, but this is true. And then we decided, to develop our relationships between us. And then we decided, to live together. We started to prepare for it, but suddenly war came up and actually it broke all of our plans. And then after 2 or 3 months, we found an option to live together, and that option was Serbia. That was actually only one option for us, because of the visa rules for Russians. Because, as you know,
you did try to go to Poland and Germany as well, didn't you?
When I was in St. Petersburg in Russia, I tried to.
We lost the sound to you, Jurij. Hope you're with us again in a second.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
And when did they stop?
I just wanted to ask you what has happened to your contact, to your friends and family in Russia?
Actually, I still have contacts, and I still, I sometimes speak to them, speak to my friends and family, and yeah.
What do they think about you moving out of Russia and with the Ukrainian?
As for my friends, they're glad that I left Russia and that I live here. And as for my parents, for the first time, they didn't treat us well, our relationships. And I tried, to convince them that they were wrong. And actually, I managed it, but, in just partly. And if I measure it in percents, I managed it by, 15, maybe 20% to convince them.
And how have you been received by Ukrainians and Russians outside of Russia? There are a lot of Russians and Ukrainians, some Ukrainians in Beograd. Do they see a mixed couple family as a problem or just normal?
Yeah, I got the point. Actually, we got an interview, and it was, some kind of love story that was published in the YouTube channel. And there we found a lot of comments about us from Russians and Ukrainians. And actually, we are surprised, like people treat us. They're actually glad that we have each other. And, not that much people think that it's kind of propaganda, it's kind of fake story, etc.
And what do you think about Russia? Will you be moving back to Russia, or has it become an alien state to you?
No, I'm not good. I'm not gonna go to Russia again. Actually, never. Because even before the war, I realized that Russia is not the place where I should live, where I want to live.
Thanks a lot for that, Jurij. And all of you participants, you're welcome to ask questions to Jurij and Maria on what moved them from Russia and Ukraine to Beograd, but also on their knowledge of Russians and Russian sentiments about the war and so on. And of course, you're welcome to pose questions to Flemming as well. And if you have a question, find the chat function at the bottom of the page and write to Fatma Charua, my colleague, and she'll have your questions ready for us. And while you type your questions, I would like to ask you, Flemming, is there an political opposition in Russia that the EU can work with, or are we so to speak stuck with the radicalized Russia you talked about?
Well, thank you. Well, we are basically stuck with the radicalized Russia, but of course there is an opposition, but it's extremely weak and it's very difficult to access. And that's because, of course, of legislation has been put in place to control this. Most of you will know Alexei Navalny, that we often refer to as the leader, informal leader of the Russian opposition. He's in prison, of course, now for 2 years. And Navalny is labeled an extremist, and he's also labeled what is known as a foreign agent. And there are a number of laws in place in Russia that the regime will use to control the opposition. One is the law on extremism, and there's a very broad understanding of extremism. Now, for instance, if you criticize the war, or if you suggest that Crimea should be returned to Russia, many other issues, you will be labeled extremism, and you will be sent to prison for that. And the same with foreign agents, which is very problematic. And foreign agents are people or organizations who receive funding from abroad. So let's say your organization will have cooperation with a partner in Russia. You may support them, let's say with printers or paper for printers, or maybe small funding for reception or something, and then they will have to register as a foreign agent because they receive funding from abroad. And it's a kind of warning to the public that these are foreign agents. You cannot really trust them. You need to be careful with these people or organizations, newspapers. So it is in place. Also, of course, there is a kind of, usually I refer to it as hyper-patriotism. So a patriotic wave. There's a lot of talk about traitors today. And again, the speech that Putin delivered yesterday was quite calm, calmer than I probably expected and a lot of people. But previously, they would have referred to people like Jurij that we just heard about as traitors. Yesterday, Putin said, well, it's fine, you can just stay abroad, live your life as you will. But there's been a lot of talk about traitors, people who have left Russia are considered traitors, and it's very difficult to navigate in this sort of hyper-patriotic atmosphere. One of the Russian newspapers just today, I read an analysis of Putin's speech, and this Russian newspaper talked about turbo-patriotism. So it gives you an understanding of what it is, that it's very difficult to navigate for politicians, opposition people, and so on. Another issue that I would just like to mention very briefly, and I had a meeting in May with Russian journalists and editors who are very critical of the regime. Some of them we met abroad, we didn't meet in Russia, we met abroad, and they say that they actually have more readers now, but it requires the use of a VPN. So a small thing that you can use on your internet connection that gives the computer the impression that you're not in Russia, you're somewhere else. And it requires that. But they said that they actually have more readers now, that people use VPNs to access the information that they publish. And that's quite interesting. And that is probably one area where the European Union, for instance, can support independent journalism, independent media. And of course, we can also support opposition politicians. Now, Rasmus, this was your initial question. Even if they are in prison, like Alexei Navalny or Ilya Yashin or others, and the European Union can do this, for instance, by insisting that they are released, or by highlighting their cases and so on, and really try to, in a way, shame the Russian regime for putting political activists in prison. So there are things that can be done, but it is very, very difficult right now.
And Jurij and Maria, do you have an impression whether there are many Russians, some Russians, that criticize the government of Putin or the war? How is that radicalized Russia that Flemming told us about? How's that playing out for you?
Actually, to my opinion, before the war, many people in Russia criticized Putin's regime because actually the Russia is kind of poor country, and the salaries are not that high, and people were disagree with Putin's regime. But after the war, something changed. I don't know, maybe some kind of huge brainwash via television. And I don't know what's happened to the people. They started to be agree with all of the nightmare that is happening in Ukraine. I don't know how did that happen. And it's impossible to believe in that.
Thank you, Jurij. If you have the possibility to put on your camera, I know the connection is not great, but it's nice to see you. And we have a series of questions in line for you, so we'll just hop out into the first three of those, Fatma.
That sounds good. The first question is from Uffe Wilkær. So Uffe, if you could kindly unmute your mic, go ahead and ask a question.
Yes, hello. My name is Uffe Wilkær. I'm a chairperson of Europe Dialogue. And thank you for this nice event. It was interesting to hear about the Russian-Ukraine couple. I have a short question for Flemming. It's about the role of United Nations. Yesterday, I was in the Danish Foreign Ministry about Denmark joining the UN peace building process. And we are also a candidate for UN Security Council. And I heard the other day in the event in Peace about Norwegian experience with UN Security Council. So how do you see UN's role in this conflict? Thank you.
Thanks a lot for that. We'll take one more question, Fatima, or two maybe.
Yeah, Rex Shade has a question. He can kindly unmute his mic.
Yeah,
Please, Rex, come forward.
it is exactly about what you were talking about before, Splidsboel. These figures coming out, I heard Graham's World this morning, and they were saying that about 5 to 7% only is against the Putin war in Ukraine, and about 70% should agree to his politics and resign. So my question is, how do you as a researcher perceive and trust these figures, and especially those surveys? How valid are they? How do you evaluate all these figures coming out?
Thanks a lot for that, Rex. And we'll take a third question as well, Fatima, because we have very many questions waiting for us.
Yes, we do. Thomas, go ahead and unmute your mic and ask your question.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for the DO team. You did a very good job yesterday. And thank you, Rasmus, for quickly explaining the questions and formulating them better. I have a question for Jurij, and that is, since you still have contact with Russia, how is the Russian people's opinion of Ukrainians? Because I've been following the war mostly on the military side, but not as much on the civilian side. And latest I saw a video from the Wagner group where they put up is a yellow team, a white team, and they just make it short. They made it looks like it was brothers fighting brothers. So from what I can see from the Wagner group and from the high-standing political Russians, they say it's more like brothers fighting brothers. But how is it for the normal people? And if you can explain a little about that. Thank you.
Those are very good questions. The first of them, what role can the UN and maybe the EU play in a peace process and in a negotiation between Russia and Ukraine? And can we trust the numbers of with these surveys with very high support for the war in Russia? What do we know about the public opinion? And lastly, how do Russians perceive, or what do they think of Ukrainians, the Ukrainians that they are at war with? So please, Flemming, you're ready to speak, I can tell.
I am. Thank you. Great questions. Thank you. First, on the role of the UN. Well, the UN, I guess, from one perspective, will be more and more important platform. Things are happening already now, of course, leading up to the anniversary of the Russian aggression against Ukraine. So the European Union will be an important platform for different states to sort of act out. It's important for a lot of number of Western countries to criticize Russia, to support Ukraine. It's an important venue for Russia to see if it can gather support. The Russian media are very much focused on this, and they look at the support that they get, which is quite small, but they do highlight this and say, look, we also have support within the UN system. So the UN, in a way, is a very important sort of platform arena for the war. And you have also, of course, during the war now a year, seen the Russian ambassador to the UN speak. You've seen the Ukrainian ambassador to the UN speak. You've seen the Ukrainian ambassador reading books while the Russian ambassador was speaking, and so on. So it's an important platform. It's a kind of theater stage in a way. So that's on the one side. On the other side, I think because the conflict is so intense, we should expect that the UN will play a small role. It's an important platform, but in terms of actual policies and in terms of actually sort of making a contribution, I'm afraid I'm a bit pessimistic, simply because the conflict is so intense. It's very difficult for me to see the parties sort of going closer to each other. And that's true for the UN format. It's true for other formats as well. But we will see more happening within the UN, I'm quite sure. In terms of
Maybe we can hop to Jurij and ask about the Russian opinions or perceptions of Ukrainians. Could you tell us a bit about that, Jurij or Maria?
Yeah, I can tell it about that. Actually, yeah, there are some, there are some opinions about Ukrainians from Russians, and they think like Ukrainian, like like a small brother. And then I don't know where it comes from actually, and they still think like Ukraine is a part of Russia. Ukrainian is a small brother, and they should do whatever Russians say actually. And yeah, it's kind of strange and it's kind of weird.
So, how do you feel about? How do Russians or you feel about? Russians leading a war, an invasion against Ukrainians? If they are the little brothers, the smaller siblings, how can you fight them? Or do people talk about that?
You mean why did they start the war?
Yeah, I mean, how do you see this war? Is it a punishment, or what is it? Trying.
No, it's not. It's not a punishment. It's only because of the Putins. Because of the Putins, he is a goddamn evil guy, and he is a brain dead old man because his thoughts about the Soviet Union is still, they still live inside him, and he wants, to reunite all the old republics to Soviet Union again. And that's why he started, to provoke himself, just if you know how the war started, Russians started, to bomb their territories, and they started to tell like Ukrainian did this. And actually it seemed like, they provoked themselves, but they blamed Ukrainians in that. And they started that war just in order, to capture all the Ukrainian land. So it's not a punishment. So it just Putin wants it. That's it.
Thank you, Jurij. And Flemming, what do we know and what kind of sources can we trust if we want to know something about Russian opinions or sentiments in the population?
Well, it's very difficult. It was difficult even before the war, but now it's much more difficult. And Rex asked about support for the war, and I mean, basically, we can't trust the figures that come out, of course. I can tell you that sometime during last summer, Russian media started quoting a figure of 20% who are against the war. So it was like an acceptable figure. And I think they understood, maybe they were told, but they understood that 20% was safe. It was okay for them to say 20% of the people are against the war, which means that it left a small part of the population who would say, well, we don't really know. And then a huge majority, of course, that would be in favor of the war. So people would understand there's a small minority within the country that are against the war, but the vast majority still support the war. And this has sort of been the consensus. So 20% was acceptable. It's very difficult for us to measure. I mean, you all know, of course, that the war is still referred to as a special military operation. There were some speculations that when Putin spoke yesterday, he would finally use the term war. I saw a comment by a Russian expert on Monday who said, I suspect that he will use the term war because we all know it's absurd. He needs to sort of legitimize the word war, but he didn't. So it's still a special military operation. And this also means that when polling centers call people to ask them about their attitude towards the war, they have to be very careful. They cannot ask about the war, they can only ask about the special military operation. So they need to ask in a particular sort of sanitized way. And also, of course, they are under influence in terms of the way that they can report. So if they do call people and they are being very honest about opposition to the war, the polling centers may sort of have to adjust the figures because they cannot show that there is a growing opposition to the war. So it's very difficult to deal with opinion polls right now.
And that means we have very many other questions, so let's move on to some of those.
Yeah, we do. Egil Rindorf, if you could go ahead and unmute your mic and ask your question.
Yeah, probably this is mostly for Flemming. I calculated that Russia and Soviet Union, since the revolution, conducted more than 17 aggressive wars and violent interventions in neighboring countries. So this whole thing indicates that it's not just a matter of Putin, it's a matter of way of life and cultural identity. So if given that, how on earth can we imagine that we can ever make a kind of peace treaty with Russia that is credible? What are the options?
That's a very good question. Let's have another one, Fatma.
Yeah, Bent Hansen, if you could kindly unmute your mic.
Bent Hansen, can we get you through? Otherwise, we'll move on to the next question and get back to Bent.
Yes, the next question is a question regarding Jurij and Maria that says they were wondering how come Jurij never wants to move back to Russia, and they also ask how the Russians are looked on that has fled Russia. And if he could maybe tell us a little bit about why he already before the war decided to leave the country.
That's a very good question as well. We can handle a third one.
Yeah, Lillian Forrest. If Lillian Forrest could.
Lillian?
Yeah, I think I'm the one. I would like to know, to what extent is there a relationship between the opposition in Russia outside and inside the country? Is there a relationship, or how can they support each other?
Thank you. Those are three very good questions. One of them, Russia has sort of taken over the Soviet Union thinking of Russia as an expansionist or imperial regime, maybe. So how can we trust any deal with a Russia that wants to expand its borders? And the other one is for Jurij and Maria. What are the main reasons that you decided to leave Russia, no matter the war? And how is that perceived by other Russians? And finally, the coordination or the teamwork between exile Russian critics of Putin and those working in Russia. Do you want to start, Flemming?
Thank you. I'd be happy to. Great questions. Thank you. How can we trust Russia? Well, we have to say right now we cannot. And that, of course, is a problem. And some of you followed. This is just like a small event, but some of you followed the Munich Security Conference over the weekend, and French President Emmanuel Macron said that he spoke to Putin a year ago about the Wagner Group, this private military company, Wagner. And he asked Putin about Wagner, and Putin said, no, we have nothing to do with it. It's nothing to do with the Russian state. And Macron used this as an example to say how Putin just sits there and openly lies, because now, of course, we all know, and we knew before also, of course, that Wagner is associated with the Russian state. So it's very difficult. And right now we cannot trust them. I think, again, the point that I made about the former empire and being cut loose, and I think I increasingly refer to this in my own thinking, but also when I speak, as I do right now, and I encourage people to see it within that. So in a way, what has been at stake for Russia and what is at stake, if we want to put it very bluntly in a way, is that Russia is the last European empire. The Russian state as it is today is the last European empire. It has never really dealt with its past. It never dealt with it. In fact, it tried sort of to polish its past again. And it has never really dealt with the loss of its colonies. We've referred in many years to phantom pains. they lost Ukraine, they lost Belarus, they lost Estonia, and so on. They had these phantom pains, and it was very painful. And in a way, what Putin has done is that he has said to the Russian people, look, in order sort of to deal with these pains, let's take some territory. And then once we've taken territory, we'll feel better again. So that is also what at stake. So the wars that are mentioned, of course, are very much wars within this area. And this is very much what is at stake. Having said that, I have to insist, of course, and now I'll sort of point in a vague direction behind me because you can't really see what's on the shelves. But what the European Union is really good at, of course, is transforming societies. So if you look at some of the relatively new member states, they also used to be in a different place, but they are transformed. And in my personal opinion, this is a personal opinion, it's also sort of a research opinion, is that societies, of course, can be transformed. So Russia can eventually reach a point where we can fully trust them and where we can fully cooperate with them and so on. But we have to realize, and the war has sort of made this very, very clear to us, that it is a long journey. It's a very hard, very painful journey. It may take generations before we reach this point, but of course it can be learned. Look at Germany, for instance, which has also had many wars. And Germany now refused to go to war and even now are being ridiculed for their position on the Leopard tanks and so on. So it can be learned. And the same will have to be done inside Russia, and we will have to assist them and insist that they do this. But we now realize it's a very, very long journey. As I said, it could be generations.
And Jurij, could you tell us a bit more about why you don't want to live in Russia and didn't want even before the war? And maybe a bit about how people leaving Russia are seen by other Russians.
Well, so what about the reasons? Actually, the main reason was Maria, because we decided to live together, and that's why I wanted, to leave Russia. And as for me personally, I just don't like Russian mentality. I don't like how they live there. Actually, how they behave themselves, because I spent my whole life in Russia, and I know those people, and I know how they live. I know how they think. And actually it terrifies me a lot, especially when they support this nightmare that is happening in Ukraine. And it's impossible, to say the truth in Russia, because when you will try to do it in Russia, if you're Russian, you will be captured by the police guys, and you will be imprisoned for a long time. So it's just simply impossible to live there, especially when you wanna tell the truth. And what about, as you asked me, what about the opposition? Yeah, what about the opposition? As for the persons who left Russia, especially here in Belgrade, they try to do their best. They try to speak the truth. They try to help Ukrainian refugees all over the world. Especially, we've got a situation when in Belgrade we have Russian Democratic Society that helped Maria's parents to get the generator, for electricity, and they actually helped. They help refugees, especially here in Belgrade, and they're doing their best. And what about opposition in Russia? They actually, it exists in Russia. Opposition exists in Russia, but they do not do some huge movements because they're afraid of being captured. So this is the truth.
And when I look at Serbia, where you live, Serbia is quite friendly to Russia, or the government of Serbia is. So how do you feel you're being received in Serbia? How's the government or the system seeing you and ordinary people around you?
Yeah, I got the point. Well, when I was going to Serbia, I actually thought that Serbs are quite friendly to Russians. And actually, indeed, for the first time, they say that, whoa, Russian, great, we love Russians, etc. But, local people, some kind of, I don't know how to say it, but they want, to trick you all the time. For example, they want to cheat you on the money, they want to trick you somehow. And all of those rumors about Russian-Serbian brotherhood is more rumor for me, especially for me, because we faced a lot of situations when we got attacked by the Serbian guys, and it's possible for me to believe in this brotherhood anymore.
Thank you, Jurij. Flemming, could you give us a brief comment on the Russian opposition working both in exile and inside Russia?
Sure, thank you. There is, of course, attempts to do opposition activities from abroad, but it's also very difficult. One of the interesting things now, I mentioned this exodus from Russia, as many perhaps as 800,000, a figure which is mentioned in the Russian media. On social platforms, you will see even higher figures, but 800,000 people left Russia last year. One of the interesting things about the current regime is that they let people leave. So opposition figures, contrary to the Soviet Union, which to a large extent insisted to keep people inside the Soviet Union, even if they didn't like the Soviet Union, the Russian authorities today are just saying, whoever doesn't like Russia, please just leave. And one of the reasons is that it's very difficult to conduct opposition activities even from abroad. It's easier in a way because these may be open societies and so on, but ultimately when you do opposition activities directed against Russian society, you want to sort of connect with Russian voters, and that's very difficult from abroad. So that maybe also explain, for instance, the experience that Alexei Navalny had when he returned to Russia just over 2 years ago, and he was arrested, of course, immediately. He probably knew. But what Navalny explained is that it was his destiny. It was his destiny to be in Russia. And I also suspect that Navalny understood that if he had stayed in Germany, he could have lived on in Germany and be free, but he couldn't influence Russian politics from Germany. He had to be in Russia to be able to influence. And so it is possible, of course, but it's very difficult to have an impact, and especially, of course, with the way that the Russian regime now controls the media, and Jurij also spoke about this kind of brainwash that is happening. So it's extremely difficult, and we should support Russian opposition, and we should pay attention to them and be aware of the activities that they do, but we shouldn't expect that they will be able to change Russian society from the distance from abroad.
Thank you. And Fatma, we have some more questions.
Yeah, we do. Michaela Marstrand, if you could please unmute your mic and ask a question.
Thank you. My concern is that whenever we express our support for the Ukrainian people and the present situation, it serves as well as immediate use for Putin in his way of collecting evidence that all of Europe is against Russia and we're all enemies of the Russian people. And I would like to ask, how do we change this rhetorics so that we don't deliver immediate words for Putin to use and misuse in his cause, but that we rather talk about how we do want to embrace the Russian people, how we do want to look to a future with them?
It's a very good question, Michaela. Thank you for that. And we can handle one more, Fatma.
Yeah, Christian Nørgaard.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you to you and the whole team and speakers. Two short questions for Flemming both. What is the truth concerning the effect of the sanctions on the Russian economy now when package number 10 is on the way? And number two is, do we see a revival of the soldier parents of the dead soldiers come back on the scene? Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. Good questions. And we can take a third one, Fatma. I know we have a lot.
Yeah, Rasmus Lysemose, if you could go ahead.
Yes, we have sanctioned Russia 10 times during the last year. And I was wondering whether it's enough. We know, for instance, China has provided Russia with war technologies. So my question is, should we sanction the countries that support Russia as well?
Yes, thank you. Those are excellent questions. We have 2 questions on the sanctions. Are they working? Can you feel them in Russia? Do we sort of hit the right people with them, the right industries? And should we sanction countries supporting Russia? Half the world, if we ask at the UN, is not supporting the sanctions. So could we go after China or other countries supporting Russia? And then we have a question how we, as Europeans, Denmark, the EU, can avoid becoming a useful enemy for Putin. How can we find a position where we are not handing him all the cards so he can tell we're just enemies? How can we play a different role? Those are good questions. And also, Christian asked about whether there are a new opposition from parents to the dead soldiers. So a lot of big issues. Would you like to start on that, Flemming?
Well, thank you. Very interesting questions. Let me start with Mikaela and say it's a good point. We all realize that this is happening, but there is no way out of it. We cannot escape. So if you were to change the tone, I mean, one of the things that we are doing now with the Russian population, of course, and the European Union is doing this, for instance, is in a way to shame the Russians, not necessarily directly, but through sanctions. We're saying you're not welcome here anymore. So this is, for instance, what we see on the visa issue. You're not really welcome here anymore because of the war. And Putin will use this. But if we don't do anything, then he will also use that. So there is no way out of this. The way that the Russian media machine works right now and the complexity of it is that they will use any issue that they can and they will spin it. So you cannot escape that. And it doesn't really matter what your policy is. If they want to, they will find a way to make the most of it. Concerning sanctions, it's very difficult to assess the effect of the sanctions. And it's one of the areas where I see the greatest uncertainty. Lots of different interpretations and prognosis concerning how the Russian economy will develop. It clearly has an effect. It doesn't have the effect that many expected back in the spring of 2022, in the summer of 2022. The Russian economy has been doing surprisingly well, partly because of very high prices of energy, natural gas and oil, but these prices have now stabilized and are at the level that we saw before the war. So some Russian experts at least, are saying that the Russian economy will start to suffer now. It will start to suffer in 23, 24, and so on, because there is a lack of technology. The Russians have been cut off from Western technology. They need to redirect. They've been cut off from Western markets and they need to redirect. And I can see even in open Russian media that they explain that they've been cut off from the energy markets in the European Union, for instance. They will find different markets, but they struggle to find markets at the same pace. So they've been cut off faster than they can find new markets. So we should expect that it will have some kind of consequence. Most Russians do not really feel it very strongly yet. It's unclear if they will. And they at least haven't felt it to the extent that they start protests because of this. If you read or listen to Putin's speech from yesterday, you will see, of course, that he does address the questions of social issues, for instance, on a new minimum wage and so on. So he is concerned about these things, and he does address issues which will concern ordinary people. And we should remember that the real income of Russians have been falling for now 10 years in a row. So it may be that they do have growth, but inflation is higher. And so they lose, in real terms, they lose part of their income, so they can buy less. Should we punish states that support Russia? Well, we already do to some extent. The US in particular. The US is very aggressive when it comes to sanctions. And I don't necessarily mean this in a negative way, but they are very aggressive. And so they will look at this and say, look, we have sanctions against these type of products. If you sell this to the Russians, then you will also be punished. And a lot of companies, including Chinese companies, are concerned about US sanctions because they are so, well, aggressive in the way that they implement this. And then finally, on soldiers' mothers, no, they're not coming back. And it tells you something about Russian society. Today I talked about this radicalization. So Soldiers' Mothers, for those of you who don't know, is an NGO that was set up and was active, especially in the 90s with the Chechen War. And they tried to expose what was happening in the Chechen War and Russian casualties. It's much more difficult today to protest and to bring casualties to attention than it was 20 years ago. And that tells you something about Russian society. And let me just put final word, let me just put the casualties rate into perspective. The Russian Ministry of Defense, has released 3 casualty figures. The most recent was on 21st of September. And it said that nearly 6,000 Russian soldiers had died. Nearly 6,000 in what was then about 7 months. This is an absolute minimum. The real figure was much higher, but this is an absolute minimum. And to put that into perspective, the Soviet Union lost 14,500 soldiers in Afghanistan, and that was in 9 years. And the Soviet population was twice as big as the Russian population today. So even by this minimal figure, 6,000 by 7 months, it's a lot. It really, really is a lot. But you don't see people protesting. You don't see people going into the street as they did in the 1980s because of the war in Afghanistan. It's simply because it's so difficult now to protest and to organize any kind of opposition, including from the soldiers' mothers.
And Jurij, could you tell us, when you speak with the Russians, do young Russian men fear to be thrown into this war and maybe die? Are their parents concerned? Do you see some fear of the sanctions or of the effects of the war among Russians?
So what about the fearness of being killed during the warfare? Yeah, actually, and I have some friends in Russia that are quite younger than me. They're about 18, 19 years old, and they're kind of, they don't want to go there because firstly, they just simply don't want to die. And the second one reason for them, just because they do not support all of this nightmare. And what about sanctions? And do Russian fear about that? Actually, to my opinion, the majority of people in Russia don't care about this because I don't know how it works. They just turn on the TV. They see all of this bullshit that coming from TV, and they still think that all of these sanctions are just jokes for them. And they will handle all of them, and that's it.
Thank you, Jurij. And Fatma, can we take 2 last questions that can be answered very briefly because we have only 5 minutes left?
Yes, I can try. Bo Vesterlund, if you could go ahead and ask your question.
Yes, it's Jurij and Maria. Will some Serbs join the Wagner forces, and does the Serbian government allow Serbs to join Wagner forces?
Thank you for that. We can take a question, an extra question.
Thomas, go ahead.
Thomas?
Yeah, just a clarification. Because it's called a military operation, it's because that it's, if you call it a war, it has a more political backlash or something. Military operation is less political, creates less political discourse, but it also make a huge handicap on what kind of military units you can use. That's why we see they don't have used strategic bombs, and they haven't put the entire Russian military to use in Ukraine. But also a question for Flemming. Since Macron and Merkel went in to make the Minsk agreement and later said they only make it to give Ukraine more time for war, do we even deserve, do the EU even deserve the trust of the Russian people? And also when we see something criticized of Ukraine or see the government, as lately we saw an Australian who commented on a demonstration of Ukrainian mothers in Kiev, and he was called a Russian propagandist, but he shows pictures of this little demonstration happened. Aren't we blaming Russia for the same things we do ourselves? Thank you.
So, question, Thomas. So, a question about the Serbia for you, Jurij and Maria, and a question about whether we, as the EU and the West, are trustworthy partners. We've seen the Minsk agreement that didn't really work. So what can we come up with that's more plausible? And Jurij, if you could make a brief comment on Serbia for us, and then Flemming will have the last 2 minutes to answer that.
I mean, is it allowed for Serbian to take part in foreign warfare? Yeah. As far as I know, it's totally prohibited. And if, for example, any kind of Serbs will want, to find himself on the Russian side of this warfare, and he will manage it, to, to return back home safely and, alive, he will be imprisoned, as far as I know, because it's prohibited for them. But as far as I know, there is some radical Telegram channels like Zlayarlova, etc. And they constantly telling bullshit, like some of the Serbians are going to there and they take part in this warfare, and they just think that nothing will happen to them. But actually, according to the Serbian law, they will be imprisoned.
Thank you, Jurij. And Flemming, can you give us a 2-minute explanation?
Well, thank you. I'll do my best. Thank you. Very interesting question from Thomas. Well, can they be trusted? The Minsk agreements really did not have a very solid foundation, and I think everyone realized that. The Ukrainians, to some extent, were never really intent on delivering. The Russians were never really intent on delivering, and there may have been also an assessment within some of the EU member states, especially those, of course, who took part in the negotiations, that this was an attempt to buy time to see what would happen. I understand the critique. It comes, I see it very often in Russian media, but you should also keep in mind, as a different perspective, that Russia, of course, has been lying about its role in the Minsk agreements, because it has actually had troops in eastern Ukraine, in Luhansk and Donetsk, in the so-called People's Republics, since 2014. And this is why now we speak about Russia's open invasion about Ukraine, because the other was a hidden invasion of Ukraine. So in a way, Russia negotiated the Minsk agreements, but hid the fact that it actually had troops already, was supporting it, perhaps even initiating and sponsoring the separatist movement. So it's really hard to sort of assess who can be trusted more here, but you should remember this when you hear the critique from Russian side also. But I think the parties to the treaty understood that this was never really going to happen. It was an attempt to buy time to see if we can stabilize the situation in some way or the other.
Thanks a lot. We spent the 60 minutes we promised on an analysis of Russia after the first year of the war. It was very interesting, and thanks a lot to Jurij and Maria in Beograd and to Flemming Splidsboel Hansen. And you will get our very famous Zoom clapping, which means everybody turns on the sound and make a clapping sound, and you can hear some of it. It's not as impressive as if we were all in the same room, but it's a huge credit for you. Thank you, Jurij and Maria, for taking your time and coming online to speak with us. And thanks a lot, Flemming Splidsboel Hansen, for coming here, talking to us. And tomorrow we'll continue this series of debates based on our little booklet here, A War in Europe. And tomorrow we'll talk about the Belarus, both the opposition and the situation, the political conflicts in Belarus. So I hope to see you again tomorrow.